Welcome to the Ashby Village Science and Ideas Group. I'm Joe Evinger, and I coordinate this group's events with the help of our co-host and tech expert, Larry Naylor. All of our members here have varied educational and work experience backgrounds, but we all share a common interest in science and new ideas. Currently have over 70 members in our group at Ashby Village and another 100 on our guest list. We meet via Zoom the second Thursday of every month from 3 o'clock until about 4:30. We have a different guest speaker each month who speaks on a topic
See, the
related to
sound
science
is
and
not in
ideas.
sync or anything.
Here are some of our future speakers and their presentation topics. In August, Mary Mackey, an occupational therapist, will discuss the design and function of the vestibular system, which is the foundation for the way we keep our posture, balance, vision, mobility, spatial awareness. In September, Ecologies, whose mission is to protect threatened island ecosystems all over the world, will present to us. In October, Veronica Tasmet will present on ocean-based climate solutions. November, Noah Finnegan will discuss moving mountains, slow landslides in coastal California. And in December, Smithsonian curator Matt Schindel will speak to us about his new book, For the Love of Mars, A History of the Red Planet. Of course, we're always looking for new speakers. Of course, we're booked for this year, but we're open for next year. If you know personally someone who might be willing to speak to us, please recommend them to me so I can drop your name when I contact them. We invite all Ashby Village members to join our group and anyone else interested in Ashby Village potentially and our presentations. They're all welcome. Quick commercial, Ashby Village is a 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. I asked Hillary to place a link to the Ashby Village website in the chat now. And to our guests, please consider a donation to Ashby Village or joining our organization. Check it out on the website. We also have another commercial, this for a group of ours that if I had more time, I would certainly be very active in it. It is Elder Action, and Julie Freestone is going to talk to you about what they're up to now. Julie?
Okay, thank you. I'll make this quick because I know some of you know about Elder Action. It's an interest group of Ashby Village, and it was formed by Rochelle Lefkowitz and Marcia Friedman a few years ago, recognizing that many of us in Ashby Village were activists. We demonstrated, we marched, we did all sorts of things that we may not be able to do now, but we still want to be connected and active. So Elder Action, we do have speakers on a variety of topics, but the focus is on taking action so we can make changes and advocate for things that we care about. And we do a survey every year to find out what people are interested in. We have 140 people on our mailing list. Climate action is a big one, voting rights, police reform, and a very important one, long-term services and support, end-of-life issues. So I think I'm here for two reasons. One is to tell you about the group, but the other thing is that we are, like many parts of Ashby Village, having a leadership challenge. And so we are looking for a new leadership team, and we need to find one by the end of December or the group is going to sunset. So I'm going to put my email in the chat, and if you'd like to know more about that or more about the group or want to join us, we're going to hear in August, we're going to be hearing about how to answer people who are claiming that elections are rigged. So that's about all I'm going to say, unless, Joe, is there something else that you think I ought to cover, or is that it?
Only to thank you for your years of service, both at Ashby Village and on this very important interest group. So thank you.
All right, thank you.
Now, the name of our group is Science and Ideas. So is there some kind of a connection between science, ideas, creativity? Well, we have someone here today who may speak to that. I'm going to ask Sarah Eminger now to introduce today's speaker, Mary Mackey.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Just to tell you that Mary Mackey became a writer by running high fevers, tramping through tropical jungles, being swarmed by armies Army ants, and reading. Related through her father's family to Mark Twain, she graduated magna cum laude from Harvard and received her PhD in Comp Lit from the University of Michigan, where she wrote her doctoral dissertation on the influence of the Darwinian Revolution on the 19th century novel. She is the author of 8 poetry collections, including Sugar Zone, winner of a PEN Award, and The Jaguars That Prowl Our Dreams, winner of the 2019 Eric Hoffer Award for Best Book published by a small press. A screenwriter as well as a novelist and poet, she has sold film scripts to Warner Brothers as well as to independent film companies. In 2020, her script Timepiece was winner of the 2022 City of Angels Women's Film Festival Award for Best Short Screenplay. In 2023, her script The Stand-In, adapted from her novel of the same title, was the City of Angels Women's Film Festival Award official selection for Best Feature Screenplay. Her most recent book, Creativity, Where Poems Begin, from Marshhawk Press, was a Northern California Book Reviewers Award finalist for Best Book of Creative Nonfiction, published in Northern California in 2023. Creativity looks at the origins of inspiration, told in a way that encourages others to find their own unique paths to the place where inspiration begins. Take it away, Mary.
Thank you so much. Wait a minute here. I'm somehow not getting the view of the speaker, which I sort of like to see. Well, I guess maybe I'll just see myself on gallery. That's okay. All right, small technical detail. Thank you so much for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to be invited to speak to this group, particularly happy. I'm going to talk to you today about, well, what I promised to talk to you about was how can scientists get new ideas? How can they become more creative? And how can you get a person who is in the box to think out of the box? And I'm going to talk about somewhat about my new book, Creativity, and I'm going to comment on various other things about creativity and what it is and where it lies in the human mind and how it transcends not just poetry, but any kind of creativity. In fact, I'm going to speak more about this, about thinking out of the box in a minute, but I'm going to just give you the answer right now, the short answer. So if you have limited time, this is it. There is no box. There never has been a box. Okay. When I was an undergrad at Harvard, I took a course from a professor named Leonard Collender Nash, who had put together a course in Harvard's History of Science department. I took this course, by the way, because I was very bad in math, and those of us who were majoring in English got to take a History of Science course. And his course was about obsolete theories and what replaced them. So phlogiston theory, a Ptolemaic universe, things like that. And this was a great system. And one of the theories was the Ptolemaic or centered system of the universe, which was the idea that everything revolved around the Earth. And that was replaced by Copernicus' system, that heliocentric system, that the Earth revolved around the sun. So you have to, if you know a little about the history of science, or even if you don't, you might ask yourself, was Copernicus' new theory greeted with open arms by great scientists and philosophers of the time, by the establishment, by everyone? Well, let me put it this way. At least Copernicus wasn't tried by the Inquisition, convicted of heresy, and condemned to spend the rest of his life in house arrest like Galileo. So I think there's a no on that. And I have a great quote from the time that Copernicus's theory came out. It's by a Lutheran reformer named Philip Melanchthon, and it says, quote, "Some people believe it is an excellent and correct to work out a thing as absurd as did the astronomer Copernicus, who moves the earth and stops the sun. Indeed, wise rulers should have curbed such light-mindedness." Now, this is where creativity ends. It's not where it begins. What you need for creativity, Melanchthon was 180 degrees off. What you need for creativity is exactly light-mindedness. The ability to entertain thoughts and ideas without prejudgment, the willingness to let your mind wander, to spend time being bored, and I will come back to being bored in a minute because being bored is a great resource, to imagine, to daydream, to have the humility to accept that human logic does not encompass all possibilities. I'm not saying you should head off into unproven woo-woo theories like the flat earth theory, or even the possibility that all the stars are being held up by angels who shop at Safeway. But before you begin to Marshall proof and look at things logically, you have to allow yourself to have the freedom of thought and imagination, to be able to entertain the silly along with the sober, the impossible along with the possible, the illogical along with the logical. You have to have complete freedom of thought. You can't put yourself in an artificial box. I want to show you an example from one of my collections of poetry, The Jaguars That Prowl Our Dreams. Can we show that on the screen right now, or should I just hold up the book? Can we show that? Just the cover of the book. There we go. The Jaguars That Prowl Our Dreams. Okay, there we go. And I'm just going to read it for a moment. There you go, just for a minute. Okay, we can take that off the book. Okay, you can go back to watching me talk. Thank you. So this is obviously not a scientific poem. This is not, something that has proof. But I want to read it to you because it takes off from science. Sciences, and particularly the biological and ecological sciences, have influenced my work a great deal, as has Darwin, as you've heard. And this starts with astronomer Seth Shostak, the director of the Center for SETI Research. And it says, quote, "The limitless content of our universe might be only one instance of a large and possibly infinite number of other universes." Okay, this is not me making this up, all right? And the poem is called Infinite Worlds. So I thought, let me imagine what that might be like. This is a piece of imagination, not a piece of scientific research. It will not make it into nature. Okay, so here we go. When you lift your fork, an infinite number of yous all lift their forks at the same instant. And an infinite number are missing their mouths. And an infinite number are choking on the tines. And an infinite number are being struck by meteors and vaporized. And an infinite number are being trampled by cattle or time-traveling mammoths or naked strippers who look like Martha Washington. And an infinite number of the strippers are spouting purple wings, just as Christ is coming back in the form of an infinite number of small, green aliens who are explaining they are a poetry collective that specializes in holographs and apologizing for the cultural disruption their guy on the cross experiment made. And that fork keeps rising and rising and destroying everything in its path as you commit suicide an infinite number of times and give birth to an infinite number of babies who drowned in an infinite number of great rivers 150 miles wide, which suddenly appear out of nowhere, carrying schools of voracious piranhas who devour an infinite number of used forks before they turn into an infinite number of gold, rats, hairpins, and hockey sticks. Because when there are an infinite number of worlds, anything can happen and will happen an infinite number of times, which is why the idea of infinity, like all things that have no limits, is impossible to grasp, even in your own kitchen, over a plate of fried potatoes with a red-handled stainless steel fork. So that's just a bit of imagination and based on a scientific principle. Now, I'm going to also read you some things from my most recent book, Creativity, because I want to talk to you about what it is. This is a book about creativity. It's not a how-to book. It's not, 17 rules about how to be more creative, which are generally completely useless. This is not how creativity, it's not, you don't just sign up for it and say, okay, I'm going to take a course in creativity and I will come out more creative. It's not how it works. So I'm going to, these books, by the way, these how-to books are a dime a dozen on creativity. This is a book that I have written attempting to explain why and how I have become creative over the years and come up with a lot of ideas. I mean, as you know from my bio, if you've seen it in there, I'm the author of 14 novels, and I'm actually the author of 19 novels. Nobody would publish 5 of them, so that's 4, it's more novels. I've got 8 books of poetry. I have another book of poetry coming out. Coming out next spring called In This Burning World about climate change. I've got, just all sorts of things. I've got 41 single-spaced pages of ideas for more things. And I have just never had a dearth of ideas. Sometimes I've been too tired to write, but I've never had a time when I didn't have ideas. So this book is my attempt to sort of give back and try to show what I think creativity is, where I think it comes from. And you'll see that it's written in terms of poetry. It says creativity where poems begin. But, you know, from what I've seen, the reason that is that this was published by a small poetry press and it was part of a series. But as far as I can see, creativity doesn't take sides. It doesn't limit itself to poetry. It's not the property of novelists, poetry, musicians, social scientists, physicists, artists, or biologists. Creativity belongs to all of us. So I'm going to read you some passages from it, which will explain what I'm talking about. And if the word poetry isn't to your liking, please substitute when you hear the word poetry, anthropologist yourself, or zoologist, or maybe maker of a better pogo stick. You know, I mean, while you're at it, think about how interesting it would be to think of an anthropologist and a zoologist bound together by a large purple anaconda leaping through the jungles of the upper Amazon on a pogo stick. And I warned you, there is no box. Okay, so here we go. And I think it will be self-explanatory, and I will be very happy to answer questions at the end. This partly reads like a memoir because one of my major premises is that creativity comes from a place before words, from a great wordless space. I am a poet that, as well as a writer who has poetry which is lyrical, mystical, accessible, and comprehensible. And so I believe the space it comes from is a wordless space. And if you believe something comes from a wordless space that has no categories, you can't exactly ask your friends, could you tell me about your wordless space? So I have had to examine myself, and that's the progress of the book. So I'm going to read you some things from this, and then I'll be happy to answer questions. And the first thing is the introduction, which pretty much tells you what I think creativity is and where I think it's located. And so this is, what is creativity? What is creativity? Where do creative ideas come from? What happens at the exact moment a creative impulse is suddenly transformed into something that can be expressed in words? To describe creativity is extraordinarily difficult because the moment of creation comes from a place where language does not exist and where the categories that determine what we see, hear, taste, and feel are not immediately present. In our daily lives, we tend to live on the surface, unaware of the complexity and richness of what lies beneath. Poetry creates itself, budding up from the depths until it reaches that part of our brains that transforms consciousness into words. Like music, a poem can be understood in a dozen different ways, all interacting with one another. This means a poem can form a continuous bridge between the moment of creation and its incarnation in language. And I want to say something aside the thing here. The reason poetry is a good subject for this talk is that poetry contains ambiguity in the way almost no other written form does. You know, scientific papers that have been vetted by peer review and published are not supposed to contain great ambiguities and be able to be interpreted 5 or 6 different ways. Nonfiction prose is not usually interpreted different ways, but poetry will allow a multiple way of interpretation which contains ambiguity. And that's a very important part of creativity, because out of each of these ambiguities, you can have perhaps a creative idea come to you. Poetry did not choose me. Poetry chose me. I did not choose it. Call it an involuntary act of creation, a constantly surprising connection between self and non-self, a movement from seen to unseen and back again. Call it, at its best moments, the movement of an adult mind back to the radical innocence and vision of the very young child who sees not only the reality we all share, but all those unnamed and unclassified parts of reality we learn to overlook as we grow older. This book is a journey to the place where creativity begins. I invite you to join me. I have a very peculiar, well, I'm going to read you. The next chapter is called Fever. Now, you will notice with these chapters, there's sometimes a poem. That's because sometimes in ordinary expository prose, logical prose, everything cannot be said that I'm trying to say because I'm trying to talk about a place before words. This, by the way, is something mystical poets and writers have attempted to do for centuries. The only difference between me and most other poets who have taken this on is that I'm not focusing it through a religion. I'm not taking it through any particular, I mean, I could start a religion. I'm sure in Berkeley I could start a religion with this. I could probably get a lot of Rolls Royces, maybe a better bank account, but this is not my way. And so I'm not doing it. But by putting a poem itself in here, it sometimes adds to in a way that I hope will suggest to you the deeper parts of what I'm trying to say. And by the way, I found out recently that Santa Teresa, when she was writing her poems and having her mystical visions, had malaria, which I think is a very interesting thing. And this chapter is called Fever. There is something different about me, something profoundly physical, yet not obvious. Put simply, in a way that doesn't begin to explain it, I run high fevers, very high, near-death experience fevers. This does not happen all the time, yet in the course of my life, on 7 or 8 occasions, my fever has suddenly climbed to 107 degrees Fahrenheit, perhaps 1 or 2 occasions even a bit higher. 107 degrees Fahrenheit, 42 degrees centigrade. Let's pause a moment and contemplate that. Brain damage and death occur if the body's temperature stays above 107.6 for an extended period of time, say 24 hours. At 106, you can experience fever-induced convulsions. This can even happen at 104. The first time I experienced one of these extremely high fevers, it almost killed me. It was 1945, World War II was still going on, and I was 6 months old, so I don't remember the details. But fever was not done to me. The next time I nearly died from a high fever was just before my 3rd birthday. I remember lying in a green couch in an overheated room. As I lay on that couch, a warm golden light, the kind you only see for a few moments at sunset, flooded the living room. My parents moved toward me so slowly that I could see their clothing billow out and collapse in an invisible wind. Bending over me, they lost their faces and floated toward the ceiling like huge birds. The Coke bottle on the table multiplied into dozens of Coke bottles, which flew up and circled in a huge glassy aura over their heads. Light weaved around the molding and splayed across the ceiling like spilled glue. Behind my parents' heads, the golden light turned into a veil composed of long, multicolored ribbons that danced in an invisible wind. The veil expanded, consuming the green couch, the blankets, the windows, and my parents. Suddenly it parted, and I saw trees with red and gold leaves, impossible because it was the dead of winter, and little children holding out their hands and calling to me to come play with them. I couldn't have had much of a vocabulary at that age. Nevertheless, words streamed into my mind and came out of my mouth, combining and recombining into entirely new things. I believe this was the moment when I was given the gift of poetry. I've captured this best in a poem entitled Breaking the Fever in my collection by the same name. In it, you can see the childhood experience I just described transformed into poetry. Breaking the fever. When I was young, fevers were attacked. The grown-ups would rub you with alcohol, wrap you in wet sheets, refuse you blankets, fan you, feed you aspirin, plunge your wrists into cold water. They knew fever had to be fought because it let children see forbidden things. At 105, I would start to hear voices, soft and lulling. At 106, the faces would appear, swimming around me. Stretching out their hands, they would gesture to me to join them. I was always very happy then, floating out on the warm brink of the world. The fevered children would sing in high voices, liquid like silver bells. Come with us, they'd say. Come play, Mary. And they'd show me maple trees turning red and gold, long aisles of sunlight, and woods that glowed and trembled. My body would start to come apart very gently, like milkweed fluff, and I'd begin to rise up toward their hands. But always, at the last moment, the dark circles of the grown-ups' faces would force me back down, and their fear would pin my chest to the mattress like black crystal paperweights. They would force more aspirin on me, more ice and alcohol rubs, more wet sheets, and if that didn't work, they would lift my naked body and plunge it into a tub of cold water, ignoring my screams. Come back, they would plead. Come back, come back. And my fever would buckle and snap like the spine of a beautiful snake crushed under a boot. Then the fever children would abandon me, and I'd be left in a world of ordinary things, light bulbs, used Kleenex, hissing radiators, thermometers. I'd see my mother's pale, terrified face, and my stuffed animals, and my brother's crib, and my precious fever would lie broken in 1,000 bits, with no way to put it back together, and I could never explain how kind it had been, how foolish we were to share it. And I want to just make a sort of comment, not sort of comment, I want to make a comment here on that. When you run an extremely high fever, this is observational. When you run an extremely high fever, when I run one, I should only speak in my own terms, having never run anyone else's fever. When I run a high fever, about up to 105, I'm really scared and it's horrible and I shake and shiver and it's awful. Start hitting 106, it starts getting good. By the time I'm about 106 and a half to 106.7, it's really good. And I'm happy. I'm not afraid of death. I'm seeing the world in a way that I can only describe as total unity and total individuality at the same time. This is why, I mean, this is very hard to describe in words. And this has been consistent over, 6 to 8 times over my life, from childhood to adulthood. And so it's made me, less afraid of death. And also I become very kind of happy and amused, and everybody else says, you're dying, we've got to do something. And I tend to say, it's okay, don't worry about it. I'm just fine, And then they put me in cold water, and I, have, when I was younger, fought them off because I didn't want to lose it. But there's a kind of, I have to say, if life presents me with a buffet of death, I'm going to take fever, because it was a really, it's a really pleasant. I tell jokes. I once spoke in rhyme couplets for 4 hours. I have witnesses. And I told jokes with punchlines, and I was completely happy until they got my fever down. And then once again, I was miserable, but I was going to go on to have more life, more fevers. So it's a very peculiar thing. And I think it's given me an unusual ability, or something to be able to enter that space, not as completely as fever, but to be able to go to that space where I believe creative ideas come from. And I believe they come from a space, at least for me they do, that is beyond words, that is beyond description in words, but which is definitely, for me at least, and I hope for other people, there. And it's a very benevolent space. And now I want to talk to you, I want to read you a little more, and then, we'll be taking questions later, but not quite yet. Okay. This is about teaching myself not to see. And it's about my first novel, Immersion. Immersion was my first novel, published by a Shameless Hussy Press, a feminist press out here in Berkeley, published in 1972. The editor was Alta Geary, who just died recently. Alta had this wonderful little press. She didn't care who you were. She didn't care who you knew. She even published 12% men, because she said that's how many women were published by male presses at the time. And she published my first novel, Immersion. So here's about that. And this is how I wrote it. And I didn't write it out here. I wrote it, as you will see, at the University of Chicago. It's the fall of 1969. I'm sitting in the University of Chicago main library at a small oak table by a large, dirty window that's covered with a hefty iron screen. To my left is a large black plastic ashtray, because, as incredible as it may seem, in 1969, smoking is still permitted in this building, which holds well over 10 million inflammable books and 65,000 linear feet of irreplaceable archives and manuscripts. Directly in front of me sits a blank notebook and 3 refillable fountain pens. I am about to do something momentous. I don't have the slightest idea how to go about it. I'm about to write my first novel, and not just any novel. It's a crazy idea to write a novel that will create in the reader a sense of what it is like to be part of the jungle, to be as inseparable from it as the trees. Is it possible to use words to plunge people into a superorganism of almost 1 billion parts that is a whole in itself, and in many ways as beyond words as the landscape of dreams is beyond description? Is it possible to build vocabularies of science and to blend the vocabularies of science and literature, to use those vocabularies and the vocabularies of biologists, zoologists, physicists, geneticists, novelists, and poets, and merge them into a single coherent whole, which, like the jungle, is more than the sum of its parts? Is it possible to create a plot and characters that will encompass these ambitions? For all novels must have plots and characters. I open the notebook. I pick up one of the pens. I have no idea how or where to start. So I decide to begin with a description of the ashtray that sits at my left elbow. I will look at this ashtray intently. I will see it as if I had never seen it before. I will view it as an alien artifact created for some unknown purpose. I will describe it so it cannot be confused with any other ashtray ever created. I will search out, find, and resurrect the way I saw the world as a very young child, a world in which categories did not yet exist, in which there was no context, no expectation, no reason not to look at the unimportant details of things as well as the important ones. Beginning a novel about the jungle with a description of an ashtray may seem like an odd choice, but recently I have become increasingly aware of a strange phenomenon. If you look at any object long enough and intently enough, it becomes incomprehensible. Put another way, it is no longer has a stable appearance, but will shift back and forth, taking on different forms and changing size and shape as you stare at it. I turn my attention to the ashtray and stare at it. Instead of trying to identify it, I try not to identify it. Sure enough, within a few seconds, the ashtray begins to shift and change, become both meaningless the way the word the becomes meaningless if you say it 100 times, and filled with possibilities the way all objects become filled with possibilities before you file them in the right pigeonhole. A black hole, a void, a revolving wheel, a floating disc, an ink blot on the flat two-dimensional surface of the tabletop without borders or depth. I believe I'm trying to begin writing a novel by freeing up my imagination from received categories, and indeed that's what I'm doing. But I'm also doing something else, something that will be so central to the way I write that it will change the whole way I go about seeing things. I am teaching myself the art of entering a state of hyper-objectivity, a state of extreme focus. I am teaching myself to stare fixedly at the world and expect nothing but what comes from that staring. I believe this kind of hyper-focus is one of the keys to the creation of a rich, complex, layered poetry, and I also hope it will turn out to be the key to a rich, layered, complex novel. Cool, smooth, blank, a hole, a dark spot shadow of a leaf, trembling on one edge, or do the edges go beyond and out beyond like auras, unidimensional to where it ends and the tabletop begins? There's no way to tell it. Do you have to describe everything to describe one thing? There's no separation. And for the better part of 20 minutes, I go on describing the ashtray in the most minute detail, trying to see it without expectation. And then all at once, the first lines of my novel appear beneath my hand like a shoal of whales reaching out of the water. I write, Eduardo is drowning, rocking from side to side. He moves like a swimmer, heads up, eyes open, fingers pressed tightly together. A neurotoxin is paralyzing his central nervous system, depressing respiration, sending his body into a series of involuntary convulsions. Closing my eyes, I stop the motion, reverse the sequence. I stop and reread what I've written. What have I done here? Well, it's a beginning. It's enough for one day. I close the notebook, pack up my pens, pick up my book bag, and leave the Scandinavian statistics section of the Chicago Main Library to the great silence of its unread books. I will come back repeatedly, day after day, to write more on immersion, this novel which I will never outline, but simply watch unfold out of my imagination like the blossoming of a great flower. So that is part of it. I also want to say something about the filtering aspect of hyper focus. For me, anyway, and when I say, I can only speak from my own experience. But I believe that if you saw everything all the time the way it is, every little shade of light, every little thing, all the rainbows and the puddles, all that, you would step out and be run over by a truck. You simply cannot look at everything all the time and be aware of all that. The brain has to filter things out and take your attention to what's important for your own survival. I mean, evolutionarily, that makes a lot of sense. And just in general, to function and be a sane human being. You cannot function in society if you're doing that all the time. And you should know, because some of this stuff sounds rather trippy. This is not drug induced, but besides that, like 99.9% of the time, I'm a very rational human being. Some people have said I'm the most logical poet they've ever met. But I can go into this state where I can focus and I can see all those things that none of us are noticing right now. I mean, there's all sorts of little light changes going on in the room around me. I'm sure there are in you. There's all sorts of things. And one thing that I sometimes, when I was trying to explain this to students, would do is say, just look at your hand without moving your vision from it for about, 10 to 15 minutes. Just stare at it. And you realize you've never seen your hand before. And all of a sudden things start happening to it. And it starts like, yeah, I see some people are doing that. Yeah. All of a sudden it starts looking different and it starts changing. And, you realize you're seeing all this other stuff, or maybe you're not really, who knows what you're really doing, what your brain's doing to it. But this hyper focus gives you a different experience. And I think out of that hyper focus, a lot of creativity can come because you're no longer in a kind of cultural, linguistic, or even habitual way that you're looking at the world. So I want to speak a little bit about how creativity, I'm going to read a little passage about, there's and I think it's a myth. There's a myth that great creators are suffering. And, I would have students who'd say, I don't know if I can be a poet, Professor Mackey, because I just don't feel depressed enough. And I'd say, well, look, you don't have to be that depressed. It's not necessarily a sign of creativity. And I'm going to read you why I think this happens, why people talk about it this way. But I think a lot of it comes from people, creativity is a great resource if you're sad, but all poetry is not autobiographical, and all poetry does not come out of pain and suffering. And all creativity, not just poetry, but creativity itself does not. So I had a very bad time in 1971, so I'm going to talk about how I looked into this. In 1971, after 5 years of drought, I wrote over 100 poems, but the price was high. Suffering, grief, loss, sadness, and despair shattered the barrier between my rational consciousness and the emotional, non-rational sources of my creativity, allowing rhythms, words, patterns, ideas, and dreamlike images to float up from that great wordless unity where they had lain hidden. Now that I had put those troubles aside, I wanted to go on writing poetry, but I didn't want to go on suffering. I had come to believe that there's another path to the sources of creativity, a gentle path that I might be able to follow without harming myself, one that might at times take me back to the world as it appeared when I was a very small child, or lead me to some of the places I go when my fever spikes above 106 degrees. I simply want to break down the barrier between my rational consciousness and the irrational sources of my creativity from time to time without ending up drunk, dead, depressed, addicted, or lying on a mattress on the floor, wondering how long it's going to take me to sit up and pull on my socks. The first writer I looked at was Marcel Proust, a man who seemed to contact the source of his creativity primarily by accident. I'm fascinated with Proust's involuntary memories, but they aren't something I'm going to be able to duplicate every time I want to write a poem. The second group of people I considered were poets who used more aggressive methods to access their source of creativity. In other words, poets who were not content to wait like Proust for accidental inspiration, but who were actively trying to contact the sources of their creativity at any cost. What I found was not the general path I was looking for, but what I had come to call, for lack of a better name, the path of intoxication. The number of poets who followed this path to the sources of their creativity was impressive. So many had lived miserable lives, drinking to excess, using drugs, voluntarily or involuntarily plunging into misery, despair, depression, and ultimately committing suicide, either by drinking themselves to death or actually taking their own lives, that one might say self-destruction is to poets what black lung is to miners, an occupational hazard. Poe, Plath, Baudelaire, Hart Crane, Mayakovsky, Celan, Anne Sexton, Berryman, Yesenin, Mishima, Teasdale, Lindsay, Nerval, not to mention the Roman poet Lucan, who destroyed himself in 65 AD at the age of 25. The list went on and on. Why had writing, and particularly writing poetry, taken such a toll? As I sit at my desk in front of a blank computation book, I suspect I may know at least part of the answer to this question. In college, in the course of studying French literature, I had come across Rimbaud's famous letter to Paul de Mornay, May 15, 1871. Here's what Rimbaud said. The first task of a man who wants to be a poet, Rimbaud argued, is to make his soul into a monster, like those child stealers who mutilate children to make them into beggars, court fools, and dwarfs. The poet trans himself into a visionary by a long, immense, and systematic derangement of the senses. He seeks out all forms of love, suffering, and folly, exhausts within himself all poisons, only to preserving their essences. This path was not going to work for me. I kept on looking. I reread all my favorite mystical poets, including Mirabai, Blake, Rilke, St. John of the Cross, and St. John of the Cross, whose Dark Night of the Soul was the original reason I learned Spanish. I examined religious rituals from a wide variety of cultures. In some of these, I found small pieces of what I was looking for, mixed with what seemed like a lot of nonsense. Gradually, I began to piece together something I thought might work. It took me months, but at last, bit by bit, I succeeded. Now, as I sit at my desk with my eyes closed, holding my pen poised over the blank page, I am gently descending into sources of my creativity, using techniques I've borrowed, invented, or which have spontaneously created themselves. It's not possible to put these techniques into words because they are leading me back to a place where words and categories do not exist, a place where they have never existed. Time passes. A few minutes, an hour, I have no way of telling. Time has a different shape here. After a while, ideas and images come bubbling up from the depths. Slowly, the seed of a proto-poem sprouts and begins to blossom. I can feel words flowing through it, whispers too indistinct to make out, as if a great crowd had gathered to admire it. I need to perform surgery on this gift from my subconscious, select it, separate it, cut it off from the wordless unity, turn the result over in my mind, examine it, memorize it, categorize it. I cut here, I cut there, I include, exclude. It takes on edges and endings, solidarity, stability, falls apart, then reconstructs itself into something specific. At last, I take a deep breath, open my eyes a little, and lower my pen to the blank page, crisscrossed with faint blue lines. I begin to write. Ghost jaguars. By day, you told us, the dead crouch in the jungle, arms wrapped around their knees, heads down, blind, living in a great blueness that expands to the horizon like an infinite ocean. At night, they rise and hunt the ghost jaguars, drink the black drink, embrace the trees. We threw your yopa seeds on the ground and trampled them, begged you to come back to us, but you'd already eaten your gods, gone hunting with the dead, and seen the sunrise, and gone blind. And the very last thing that I'm going to read to you is about the mystery of creativity. And then I will ask you for your questions. And it starts with, well, a stretch of water lies before me, black and smooth as polished ebony. There's no depth, no ripples. Today, of all days, far up in the Amazon here, 1,000 miles or more from any city, I see only reflections that reflect themselves and then reflect themselves again. Sky, drowned trees, clouds, air, water, vines, a shatteringly hot sun. I cannot tell which is real and which is the mirror image. I am lost without a horizon, passing through a world of hallucinations that multiply into dreamlike images on the water and keep on multiplying. I am exhilarated, almost ecstatic. After an absence of many decades, I have finally returned to the jungle. This afternoon, I'm floating on the famous Black River of Brazil that merges with its sister Solimões downstream to form the Amazon. 20% of the water reaching the oceans of the world flows down the Amazon, and I'm riding that flow, or rather I was until a little while ago. Now I have shipped my paddle and stopped to float silently over the mirrored sky. I stare at a wall of trees that lies some 200 yards ahead of me. The trees look nothing like the wavering giants I remember from Costa Rica. How tall are they? 30 feet? 40? The trees are huge. Most are 100 feet tall, some as much as 200. And they exist, millions of them exist, in almost complete solitude. No one harvests their fruits, or strips off their bark, or burns them, or clear cuts them, for a very simple reason. Every wet season, the Black River floods an area the size of California for months at a time, rising 60 feet or more and sending every living thing that can't breathe water scrambling into the canopy. After many years, I have finally realized that the jungle has always been my great theme. The theme that took me the closest to the worldless reality that I had perceived as a child during high fevers. But it has taken me until I was 50 to write more than a scattering of poems about it. Why? Why had it taken so long to become the poet I was probably inclined to be from the time I was a child? The truth is that even now I don't know. All I can say is that creativity is a gift. You can't board it like a bus. It's ephemeral, phantom-like, ungraspable, indescribable by its very nature, because it comes from a place where words have no dominion. Inspiration comes in its own time, often as a surprise, and frequently in a language composed of images and faint suggestions that need to be decoded. I dip my paddle into the water beneath the dugout, and a new poem begins to bubble up from the deep. Suddenly, a light breeze blows across the water, bringing with it the scent of leaves and mud, and all at once the mirror beneath my canoe shatters, taking the sky with it. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy now to take questions about any of the points I raised or any of the things I read to you. And perhaps, Sarah, are you going to moderate, or can somebody put up their hands? Because I'm not sure I will catch everybody. Hi, Sally. Yeah.
Yes, I am a performing poet, and I've never published a book
Mhm.
because I haven't wanted to. I love to perform because I really get into it. I'm
Yeah.
told that I'm somebody else when I'm reading my poems. I've had that comment several times. And then another thing, I wanted to ask you if you have poems you think are better performed than read. And the other part of this question is, sometimes I begin to get a poem, it may be really good, but if I don't write it down at that moment, it's gone and it does not come back.
You know, since I carry my phone around all the time, I've taken up just dictating into my phone. This is good for all creative ideas. Like I'll take a walk or something. I find walking really well. I know I also promised that, yeah, I think writing things down as soon as you can is good. If in the middle of the night, that can be a little hard, but talking it into the poem, and then you can email it into your phone, then you can email it to yourself, is really a practical way to go about it. And with
Great
all
idea.
creative ideas, not just with poetry.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sure you're welcome. Anybody else?
Hillary, are you going to deal with the chat?
Oh, the chat. Right. I need to look at the chat. Let me see here. Where's my chat? There. Hey, I see notes. I see, Okay, I'm having a little trouble locating the chat here. I know
Well,
I should.
perhaps, Mary, what we sometimes do is ask Hillary to just call on people in the order that they sent the chat. Is that okay, Hillary?
Sure. Oh, well, it's okay with me. Yeah.
There are no questions in the chat right now.
Okay. Well, let me then just talk a minute.
Oh, Susan has a question.
Okay, Susan.
I actually sent you a chat message, Mary. Please, this is really a serious question. Did the ashtray make an appearance in the jungle in any form?
No, it didn't. The ashtray never made an appearance in the jungle. The ashtray became the spark for it, for describing everything, and for getting me into the state of mind to be able to think in that way and to be creative in that way. But there's no ashtray in the book. The only ashtray is what you know about it. But the book itself is totally set within the jungles of Costa Rica in the late 60s. Woman looking for, personal and sexual liberation in the jungle. And it has a kind of
Is that always the case, so that the medium by which you come to the point of the poem?
No, it's not always the case. And sometimes, well, let me think about that in a minute. Yeah, I mean, I don't always, there's a way I've learned to focus where I can kind of go in my mind. And so I'm not focusing on an object exactly. So the medium doesn't always come into the poem. The objects don't come into the poem. I might have a line come in my head or something, but the object itself doesn't come in. I also promised you that I would talk about boredom for just a second. I want to tell you how I wrote a New York Times best-selling novel. I had written a 350-page novel about a woman botanist who went into the jungles of Costa Rica, which I knew a lot about. I mean, although I wasn't a botanist, I volunteered at biological field stations as sort of unpaid gopher for a significant period of time. So I was writing it, and it was no good. I couldn't make it work. And at one point, she went back to New York to watch her sister do some, ballet performance at Lincoln Center. But that was very, very minor. And what happened was that I then got up, and I was just giving up on this thing. I couldn't do it. There was only one chapter. The ballet chapter was pretty good. Nothing else was any good. Standing in the shower with, water pattering on my head in a bored and kind of just nothing mood where nothing was coming. And suddenly I had the revelation that I had just written the end of the book I should have been writing, which was about ballet. So I wrote a book about 3 generations of women involved in ballet. It worked beautifully, and that was the book that became, published by Simon and Schuster, became a New York Times best-selling novel, and it still is. Right now, there's people looking at a movie deal for it. So there's just this stuff. It comes to you when you let your mind just go. When you're not trying so hard in many ways. I see another hand that looks like Joe. You got a hand?
I do. Mary, I'd like to ask you about, in particular, jazz musicians. They can be some of the most creative people. They'll play the song through once, just as it's written, and then somehow this magic occurs, and they listen to each other, and music is produced that they can't replicate. It's totally in the moment. Is that
Yes, I
similar?
think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I feel that that's true. I've always felt that way about jazz. There's some jazz that I like better than other jazz, but I think that improvisation in jazz is that moment of just letting yourself just create, you get in sync with the other people, you're being creative, and you're out there, and you're not trying to play by a logical prescribed form. You're not reading music off a stand, you're improvising with it. Yeah. And I think that improvisation is a very important part of creativity. And that's why you have to be open to surprise and accident and even the silly, because if you exclude things, then you don't get that spontaneity.
Thank you.
Sure.
Sarah?
Sarah.
Yes. I have a couple questions. One is specifically the idea of the place before words. Does somehow the things that you've absorbed, do those things just kind of stay there and ferment, as it were, until it can come out?
No, it doesn't.
Because you were three, right, with that first fever?
Oh, you mean how can I remember it? I just
Yeah.
remember it. I remember it.
Okay.
And I don't. I have this bizarre memory that, now of course, there's always been a lot of studies that say maybe childhood memories aren't specific and everything. But I've checked these things out with people. Now, my parents, of course, couldn't check out what I was doing. But before they died, I checked out with them all sorts of things. Like I can remember the linoleum on the floor. I can remember pans, the color of pans we made snow cream in, and I'm just barely just under 3 at that point when I'm sick.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just have a memory that just sort of does that. And I certainly can remember the way it looks and feels. And so I can remember these instances. I'm not blotted out by them when I have these fevers. I can remember them very distinctly. And I'm sure there's some inaccuracy in it because I'm only 3, but I have a pretty good, and I haven't, I didn't write it down until I started writing this book, but I had checked it out with them before. And I did that on a number of bases because it's peculiar to have a memory that goes back really far. And so when I checked out some other things with them about the house and various other things we did, and very specific, concrete visual details. And I have a very visual memory. So yeah, I just have a memory that works like that.
So my other question, totally different, is do you have any favorite local bookstores that we might support you at?
Well, yes, Mrs. Dalloway's is one of the good bookstores here. And that's over on College, and it's an excellent bookstore, and I've done readings there. I've mourned the passing of Cody's for quite a while.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful bookstore. So I would say Mrs. Dalloway's. There are, any independent bookstore deserves your support right now because they are falling on hard times in many ways. But
yeah.
So I'm just going to say Mrs. Dow. I'm not going to give you a huge list, but that's an excellent bookstore.
And are you speaking anywhere soon?
Well, no, I'm not, but I will be doing some I'm not doing, I have done some things. Summer is usually a sort of low point, but at the beginning of September, I think it's September 3rd, I'm doing another online interview on creativity, on my work, on poetry, novels, all sorts of stuff, but also just the meaning of art and, you know, its relation to science and other things. This is part 2 of a series of interviews you can find on YouTube. And if you look me up on YouTube, you'll find part 1 of the interview. It's by an experimental filmmaker. I also talk somewhat about film scripts because I'm a member of the Writers Guild. You know, they send me the discs for the, you know, Academy Award in that season and everything for the Writers Guild Awards. So I have a kind of wide range of stuff I do.
Thank you.
Susan has a question.
I'm sorry, this is kind of a comment rather than a question. I just wanted to say how much I love that fork poem. And
thank you.
that I about just, I don't know, 2 stanzas into it, I said, wow, this is Schroeder's cat on steroids.
Absolutely.
And I'm thinking there's an infinite number of stanzas for that poem.
An infinite number of what?
Of stanzas for the poem.
Right, of course there would be an infinite number. You could go on and on and on, infinite. Yeah. Yes, and you know that's in the Jaguars That Prowl Our Dreams. This is the only copy of the only place you can find it right now is in the Jaguars That Prowl Our Dreams. And this is the book that won the Hoffer Award. But that was one of my, you know, favorite. Oh, Hillary, I think, is going to put it up. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, Infinite World. It's called Infinite Worlds. It's right at the beginning. And it was a lot of fun to write. And I often do that. I mean, in my new book, I'm taking comments by scientific, you know, climate scientists and things on climate change, and then I'm writing poems to them. I'm writing this interchange between the simple epigraph of the scientific research and then the imaginative look at it in poems. And I think one thing poets can do, particularly in poetry and in novels too, but I think particularly in poetry, is imagine scenarios that that people ordinarily would not imagine, you know, multiple scenarios. So, you know, what's it going to be like in 20 years? I mean, we know the predictions, but what would it be like to actually be living then? You know, what can you imagine? I'm not being prophetic or anything. I'm just saying it allows a sort of scenario imagination, you know, like government think tanks, they have scenarios for everything, including, I believe, alien invasions. So, you know, I'm contributing my bit to climate change in my new book, In This Burning World. Yeah.
Oh, did you talk about boredom?
Did I talk about boredom? I hope I did, but I hope maybe you were too bored to listen. Yes, I talked about how boredom is this very rich field. See, what boredom is telling you, I believe, is that you want to be doing something, right? But you don't know what you're doing. But so if you go to, you know, playing video games or, you know, Scrabble or, you know, doing other stuff, what will happen is that you'll miss the benefits of boredom, which are the benefits of having things come into your mind that aren't being fed to you from the outside in some way. I also find I'm not bored on walks, but I also find that I find a lot of ideas when I just walk. And I don't play music when I walk because I want to be in that moment and I want to give, you know, I want the possibility of ideas to come to me. I've solved a lot of things by walking. And of course, as I said, with my novel, A Grand Passion, the ballet novel, I've solved things by standing in the shower and letting the rain hit my head. So,
I have another question, if I may.
Sure.
Showers. I have some of my best ideas when I'm taking a shower. What's
Absolutely.
going on there?
Yeah, you want me to comment on that? Sure. Well, my feeling is that, you know, first of all, when you're in the shower, you're not trying to do anything but take a shower. And it doesn't take much, you know, doesn't take much mental aptitude to take a shower. All you have to do is make sure you get in there and you don't fall. Okay. And so you get this rain pattering down in your head, sort of vaguely rhythmical, and you're cut off from sound and the rest of the world. And, you know, you're not looking at a screen and, you know, you're doing something. So you're sort of satisfied when you're doing something. And then you're just sort of standing there and your mind tends to wander. And it's that moment when your mind wanders that ideas come to you.
Is that somehow similar to meditation? Is that what's going on in?
Well, I have been meditating, and this is not a word from our sponsor. I have been meditating every day since 1975. and I meditate. And they're two, for me anyway, they're two different practices. I use a simple mantra meditation. I don't do Vipassana. I don't do insight. I just do a mantra, you know, kind of just ordinary meditation with a mantra. My mantra isn't Om, but it could be Om. I'm just doing that. With meditation, what happens is ideas come up to be, a stress comes up and you kind of get rid of them. You know, you don't want to have an agenda when you do meditation. You don't want to think about creativity. You don't want to think about writing when you're meditating. And so when you're meditating, what you're doing is settling down and you're letting go. When you're doing this other kind of creative thing, you're open to doing something with what comes to you. But I would say that trying to be creative and meditate would be two different purposes hitting each other. Meditation is a kind of complete relaxation, but it's not and it's a movement sort of out of the world. This is a movement sort of totally into the world without expectation, is the more creative moment. And so I do find them very different. Now, I don't do every kind of meditation, and I'm not all people. So other people might give you a different answer, Joe.
You know, I have a question about how much time you might spend alone. I moved into an assisted living 10 months ago now. And I was at first pressured to socialize. That was the whole thing. I had to socialize. Well, it turned out that virtually 90% of the people here are pretty much into dementia, which I'm not. I'm not almost 92, but I have a 70-year-old mind. And so I didn't find a good place for myself here, and I chose to spend a lot of time alone. Do you choose to spend a lot of time alone?
I spend time alone, but I'm very clear on the idea that I neither want to work all the time nor be isolated all the time. So what I tend to do is, this is sort of a personal issue. My dad was, a doctor at a time when men worked all the time. A very, very sweet man, but he was gone a lot and he was not able to have a kind of friendship and stuff. So I value friendship a great deal. I value community a great deal. So I try to balance the two a lot. So what I do is I try to work often in the mornings. Maybe I can't work more than 5 hours a time without just losing, creative ability. I mean, I could balance a checkbook or I could go to the store, but I can't write for more than that max. So I tend to write in the mornings for, maximum about 5 hours. And then I like to be with my friends, my, family members. I like to do things with people, and I don't like isolation. I'm pretty much a pack animal. So I just go back and forth between the two, and I try to balance them out. And that is what makes me happy, is to both be deeply in community, have friends, be friendly to people, be part of a other world. I actually really like people. I like being with people, and at the same time taking the quiet time for myself.
Thank you.
So, Mary, what's on your bucket list?
You know what? I tried to empty that bucket before I got old.
Good for you.
Me too.
So, I mean, somebody said once I've traveled more than anybody they knew who wasn't running from the law. So, I mean, that's not entirely true, but I've done a lot of things when I was, young enough to climb the steps of the pyramids, and I just wanted to do all that. I mean, I have some things that, I might want to do, but I no longer, I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I wanted out. Okay. There's nothing wrong with Indianapolis, but it was not a good fit for me at the time. It was a time of McCarthyism. It was a very difficult time. And I went away to college, and if you're in Indiana, at least when I grew up, we weren't seeing the world. You weren't having those cups of coffee in cafes in Paris. You weren't doing all that. So I really wanted to see the world, and I have, and I'm very happy about it. So I feel that I don't have a regret. There's the things I don't want to do. I don't want to jump out of an airplane with a parachute. I don't want to do any of that. So I have never sought adventure, but I can tell you, if you want adventure, spend less money when you travel. That's you want adventure travel. And I've got a book, it hasn't been published yet, called Never Go to the Beach with Mary. And it's a series of various things that have happened to me over the years, some of them horrifying, but I'm a survivor. Here I am. So I've never intentionally sought danger. I've never intentionally sought adventure, but it has come to me. So I really don't have a bucket list.
Okay. Any other questions? In which case, Sarah, did you have a question?
My question is very quick.
Sorry, I didn't.
Which is you referenced your Simon and Schuster best-selling novel. I noticed that there are many books on in your bio.
Yeah. If you go to my website, which is a word for marymackey.com, yeah, there's a lot of books with a little summary of each one. That's about 3 generations of women in ballet, starting in Tsarist Russia. I wrote it because I wanted something that women had done for a period of time that they had a lot of success in that went back, so that we could kind of look at that, you know, and there were women writers, but it's not very interesting to write about a woman writer. So, so yeah, so that's called A Grand Passion, the grand passion being ballet. It's also has a pretty hot love affair in it too.
Thank you so much for today. Oh.
Thank you. It was a
Yes,
pleasure.
bravo. Thank you very much for your time today. We really
you all.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
And